This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus and another edition of our World Affairs Roundup. Roundup regulars John Kotska, Ann Hamilton, and Robert Craig have removed their face masks, sanitized their hands, and have joined us once again as we take a look at Trump in India. Donald Trump paid a state visit to India last week that included a 100,000-person Namaste Trump rally in the world's largest cricket stadium, India's response to the Howdy Modi event in Houston last year. Did he come back with more than holiday snaps of the Taj Mahal? Dealing with the Taliban. The U.S. and the Taliban agreed to a week-long reduction in violence aimed at building confidence for a broader peace deal. Conspicuously absent from the table was the Afghan government. How likely is an end to America's longest war? Irish election aftershocks. An election in Ireland earlier in the month yielded an historic result. Nationalist Party Sinn Féin topped the polls, breaking a decades-long lock by Ireland's two main political parties. Sinn Féin's perceived association with the Irish Republican Army, however, has made forming a government a challenge. But first, to an ER near you, as novel coronavirus, now dubbed COVID-19, continues to spread around the globe. Have we reached the true pandemic scale? And what are some of the larger effects of the outbreak? Well, John, maybe we can kick it off with you. First of all, where are we in terms of just scale?
Scale. Well, let me even throw something in ahead of that, and that's called a black swan. Black swan's a unforeseen, serious issue, can be both positive and negative, although in this particular case, the consequences are rather very negative. We're probably getting close, by the time this airs, we're probably over 100,000, but we're getting close to 100,000 people that have been diagnosed as having the virus.
And significantly now, the number of new cases is larger outside of China than within China.
Correct. And we're probably at around 200,000 plus deaths in this process. It's up to 47 plus countries, and I say the plus because we keep adding them rather quickly. The most serious places are South Korea, other than China, are South Korea, Italy, and Iran. The World Health Organization sees that this has pandemic potential, although they haven't yet committed to that. What we're seeing is a issue that not only has medical consequences, but economic, political, even legal consequences over an issue called force majeure in contracts. And then there is the big one called fear in this whole process. I'll just say a couple words about the economic side of this. The world economy was moving in a direction of a recession, kind of drifting in that direction. This will probably hasten that process. When you look at China and you compare China to where it was in 2003 with the SARS outbreak of the coronavirus, Chinese citizens now travel significantly more broadly than they ever did before, which opens up more avenues to spread this disease. And the Chinese economy now is significantly more important in terms of the world economy and all of the connections that go there. But I'll leave that and we'll move on.
About 2,000 deaths, right, John, so far?
200,000.
Yeah, I think you may have added a few zeros there.
I think it was 2,000.
So it's 2%.
Right.
It's about
2.1%, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. We don't want 100% yet.
You don't want to increase the fear even further.
Right.
So, Ann, how did China's political system contribute to the outbreak? I mean, You would think in a economy where the central government has that much control, they'd be much more able to contain something like this. But there's an argument to be made that it was actually the reverse. How does that go?
Well, you see this a lot in authoritarian governments, and not just today. I remember in the Soviet Union, a lot of people, especially, the top leaders, used to always blame the bureaucrats for everything, for sort of covering up information and not letting it get to the top. And a lot of people actually believed that too, especially with respect to Stalin. So it's the control over information, which has greatly increased, censorship in information, which has greatly increased under President Xi, could have worked to his detriment, to the detriment of all of us, actually, because the first cases appeared in hospitals in Wuhan in early December, and it wasn't, and they just kept trying to quash the rumors despite greater evidence, and it wasn't until January 20th that the president finally acknowledged it and then finally imposed the quarantine on Wuhan a couple days, 2 or 3 days later.
There's that good Dr. Li.
Yes, the poor doctor who tried to warn about this and got in trouble for that and then ended up dying. So he's become a martyr in the whole thing. But it's an extraordinary long period of time for this to have been developing, with all sorts of, there were people in the hospital in early December with evidence of this.
Well, Robert, looking at the response here in the U.S., the president has indicated that we have it totally under control, do we?
Yeah.
Well, Anne is perfectly right about the Chinese governmental system being a liability to some degree in terms of this getting going. It actually may be in a better position than we are now to try to check any further advance, because it's an authoritarian country. But in the United States, there's a lot of concern. President Trump had sacked the pandemic experts at the CDC, and he has cut the CDC, cut the NIH, or tried to, but did cut the Center for Disease Control. And he has put Mike Pence in charge, apparently to reassure people, the vice president, but because of his great healthcare record in Indiana, now he's very well known for throwing tens of thousands of people off the Medicaid rolls, but he's also known for failing to act on an AIDS outbreak in Indiana on moral grounds, and after a couple of months having reversed himself. So I don't know. Some people speculate to me that perhaps Trump is wily enough to try to make Pence the fall guy. But really, it's very clear that Donald Trump is, as any elected official would be a president, but he even more obsessed with his reelection and trying to prevent this from being a net negative. And John's right. The concern that it's going to hasten a recession is very bad timing for President Trump.
So what about this? Is the current state of the U.S. government really up to it? And if not, why not? Think of what kinds of agencies need to interact in this sort of situation.
Before we go jumping off the ship, thinking that it might sink, there's only one case that has been diagnosed in the United States, and unfortunately, it comes from someone who did not have any known connections to anyone who was carrying, which carries with it another dimension and another level of concern. But I think it's premature to say how we're going to react to this. I don't think that you can make political statements about this, but I don't think that they're appropriate or warranted at this particular point. We may come up and find our government lacking, but I don't think it's fair to say so yet.
I do think, though, that the fact that there have been a lot of cuts in important staff that would deal with this, and you need national security, you need the healthcare agencies, you need science, everybody working together, and plus all the people, local people, to coordinate any responses. But even right away with the one case in California, the testing got delayed because there was a problem with the testing kits, which I think was put by the CDC, and they've only just
All the results have had to go back to the CDC for analysis.
And I think it's President Trump who told us that we'd be reassured by Vice President Pence being the point person, so it's therefore fair to consider how qualified he is for that position.
Well, let's move on to India, where Prime Minister Narendra Modi hosted Donald Trump last week. And what were the atmospherics, and what did the trip tell us about U.S.-Indian relations, Ann?
Well, I think President Trump's reaction to his reception in Gujarat, the home state of Narendra Modi, was that this is the best reception that's ever been given to a head of state of all time. I mean, it's very, very Trumpian, but I laughed when I saw that, because I thought about the Saudi Arabians and the reception they gave him and wondered whether they would be offended. But it's, it was a huge, huge affair.
He lives in the moment.
And they're very, they're very compatible, the two individuals, and clearly really like each other. But unfortunately, that hasn't gotten them very far in terms of tangible deals. I mean, they did end up making some deals on the sale of helicopters.
$3 billion
$3 billion worth. So that's definitely something, and some other minor deals. But they did not complete their major trade deal that they were hoping to complete.
So, Robert, what's in it for each leader? What was Mr. Modi's motive? What was Trump hoping to get out of the trip?
Well, they're both part of this kind of nationalist surge across the world, right? And so part of it is they're both looking for legitimacy from each other, right? Trump would like to be seen as a successful statesman on the world stage and getting good trade deals. Or the trade deal they had planned to announce has been held back, apparently because of disagreements, but he's promising there, and Robert Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative, was not brought because it was thought there would be some big rollout before. But Modi certainly is under a lot of fire for his citizenship policy that would give fast-track citizenship to every major religion in the region except Muslims, and therefore is thought to be part of Hindu nationalism. And Trump, quite frankly, not only would like an economic victory, he would like to, as I say, look like he's conducting foreign policy successfully, but frankly, and this is not a political statement, this is any State Department observer would have to point out that President Trump has affinity for nationalist strongmen around the world. And so Modi is taking advantage of the affinity that might exist and built a relationship, which is certainly to India's advantage.
As you look around the world, you're seeing increasingly more of those strong authoritarian leaders. So it's going to be harder and harder for him to find the alternative.
Well, Robert, you touched on this, the Citizenship Amendment Act. Donald Trump indicated, he said, quote, "We did talk about religious freedom, and the Prime Minister is working very hard on religious freedom." So what was the situation on the ground during the visit?
Well, it's terrible. There have been days of riots, at least 20 people killed. And some people are predicting that and it was mostly Muslims against Hindus, both sides, committing horrible acts. And some people are starting to think that these could be like the riots. There were large religious-based riots in 1984 when the Sikh bodyguard killed the prime minister. There's also in 1992 that had to do with the razing of the temple at Ayodhya. Again in 2002, I think. So there have been these major incidents of massive Hindu-Muslim riots that have led to thousands of deaths. So there's concern that these are right now, they're in Delhi. So they're close to the center of power.
And going back to the founding of India and the partition of Pakistan.
Well, that too, yes, of course. I was just trying to think of more recent incidents.
There's a ISIS group up in Kashmir called Jundal Khalifa that is now taking advantage of this unrest and is bringing its influence and its organization down into India proper.
Well, let's stay in the region now and look at the U.S. and Taliban, who have taken the first step towards a peace agreement. So how would a deal impact the government of Afghanistan and, perhaps more importantly, everyday life on the ground? So First of all, what had been agreed to, and where are we in that process?
So they've agreed to a 7-day reduction in violence, where the Taliban will no longer commit violent acts. And after that, they're supposed to sign an agreement by which the Taliban commits to entering into negotiations with the Afghan government, which, as you said in your intro, was excluded from this. And the U.S. will commit within 6 months to a major reduction in its troops. And then there are a lot of things that are unclear about all of it. There seem to be many different scenarios that could play out between the relationship between the Taliban and the Afghan government.
Which Afghan government?
Well, that's a problem too. There's a disputed authority within the Afghan government.
The coalition of warlords and their representatives.
Right.
Yes.
So, but there are just a lot of details that haven't been worked out.
And then there's the enormous consequences. As there's 12 to 13,000 American troops there. Right. At what point are they no longer able to provide security for all of the NGOs, the aid organizations that are there for the embassy? And what happens to the people who were their clients who bought into all this, and especially women in this case? There are already stories coming out that women are not, women's rights are not part of any known part of the agreement that is still yet to be fully defined.
So this seems to be a rather unusual situation in which we're negotiating war and peace in a nation without bringing the internationally recognized government to the table. So how did that come about?
Well, this is one of the Trump administration has been willing to engage in unconventional negotiations. The Palestinian-Israeli agreement without the Palestinians is another example. In this case, though, I will say that this is the United States' longest war, and it lost its purpose 2 years, 3 years in.
How many years?
Yeah. And so, quite frankly, it may be a messy exit no matter what we do, and we're not changing the situation. It does stand a better chance than Vietnamization did, but most experts think it's a very perilous path, and that probably Nepal or Venezuela are too rosy, believe it or not, that maybe if they're lucky it's like the Philippines, which is a lot of instability, but does eventually mostly convert a civil war into at least more conventional instability in politics. But and then the whole question of women's rights and whether is, particularly given that the Bush and Obama administrations really emphasized that, and rightly so, it doesn't seem like there's any guarantee there, but there's been a huge change in public opinion, and a lot of women there's been a huge social evolution where more and more women are working or in schools, et cetera. So it's pretty clear that even in the worst case scenarios, that Taliban can't go back to before, but they still could go pretty far back, I'd be afraid.
I think you're being optimistic.
Okay. Well, John is the experienced diplomat as he can, so I'll defer to you on that.
Well, finally now let's go to Ireland, where efforts to form a governing coalition continue following a historically strong showing by Sinn Féin in the recent election. So, Robert, talk a little bit about how a strong Sinn Féin showing is significant.
Well, it's a very bizarre situation because the two mainline parties, which in many have dominated Irish politics, who don't like each other at all, like the Democrats and Republicans in the U.S., they have said it's a terrorist party, talked about the IRA roots. That wasn't its appeal. And in fact, it attracted something similar to the Bernie Sanders coalition of a lot of excited young people. It doesn't call itself socialist, but it used to. Mary McDonald, their president of the Sinn Féin, won the most votes, though she cannot form a government. And it appears at this airing like the two other existing parties, the dominant parties, will go into coalition.
Which is interesting, since there's an argument to be made that Sinn Féin's showing was in large part a product of a throw the bums out, a pox on both their houses.
And it'd be like the Republican, mainline Republicans and the most of the Democratic Party combining to prevent Bernie Sanders from becoming president. Some differences, but there's some similarity, and the big issues were health care by far, though it's a much more public system than ours. They'd made austerity cuts, and therefore there's waiting lists to get in, but to health care, but not nearly as bad as the U.S. as far as costs or people going bankrupt, but still the biggest issue, 35%, I think, roughly, of people say was their top issue, and then housing. And there's been a housing bubble, a lot of speculation, and so rents have skyrocketed, and people can't afford homes anymore. And really, it's those austerity kind of neoliberal solutions that also sparked Brexit and have sparked both nationalism and, say, the Sanders movement that you see at play here. But it doesn't seem it's going to achieve really power right now. So it's not an earthquake, but it's a major tremor. But it has certainly shaken Irish politics down to its roots.
You know, what really was a surprise was that Brexit was not an issue. At 1%, it was down at almost a non-issue.
So what about this argument that Sinn Féin is not a responsible coalition partner because they have blood on their hands or whatever? I mean, have they made that transition from sort of a radical militant party to just sort of a left-leaning conventional party?
I think they have. I mean, certainly in the Good Friday Accords and all, there's, that they were participating. Jerry Adams was involved, and he was. He always claimed that he was not a member of the IRA, but there's lots and lots of evidence that he was. And there are still a lot of questions of him. But it's been a long process. But it's not the first time that you've had a party that participated in some kind of movement against, that involved violence that then became a participating party. You think there were even efforts in Colombia to bring the FARC in. I know they're very controversial. You think about the PLO becoming, a party on it. It's very common in history.
It's not the basis of their support in this election.
No, it isn't.
So, and the players are not there. So they're down to these conspiracies that there's a secret directorate somewhere in the north that's not visible.
That's the second conspiracy of the night.
But, I'm reporting the conspiracies out there, which are ubiquitous. And quite frankly, both of the mainline parties also have their roots in paramilitary forces just further back.
Right, from the independence movement.
Yeah. But remember where we started when we said this is a pushback, a unhappiness vote. Yeah. So it doesn't give Sinn Féin a particularly mandate to go ahead and do whatever they want.
Except they're not going to have power, but you would need a major government intervention and a reining in of kind of austerity and neoliberal kind of economics. They want housing to be built to scale and be much more public and not just given away in subsidies to private speculators and venture capitalists.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So what about this idea, though? I mean, again, if it's a vote against the long-standing, long-tenured two other parties, is a coalition between the two of them, and then some third party to just make up that last difference. I think there are 160 seats in the parliament, so you need 81. They've got very close between the two of them. They need someone else to.
Shouldn't we be drinking?
Labor's been in coalition.
Shouldn't we be drinking Guinness when we're talking about this?
Well, who says we're not? No, I guess we're on PBS, so no, we're not.
No, the Green Party has 12 seats, and I think that but it's going to be an odd, cast of characters trying to put together legislation and all.
They can form a government, but if the housing crisis gets worse and health care keeps getting worse, then
yes, of course.
Then they could see a greater earthquake down the road.
Or they can take this as one of the planks that they're going to focus on and recognize that those are points of unhappiness.
And that's why I don't know enough about what their will to do that is, or how tied in they are to the austerity course they've been on since at least 2016.
Well, and the clock is ticking. I mean, there's not an unlimited opportunity to form a government, right? I mean, at what point do we have to go to new elections?
It's kind of like Israel, huh?
Right, exactly, same situation. And how does that play out? If in the matter of months we have to go back to the polls, what does that do for Sinn Féin's prospects?
It It's hard to say. I mean,
That's a rhetorical question, right?
yeah, it's like, I don't know, the Italians have shown their ability to hold many, many elections and settle nothing, right? So,
It's a national sport.
Right.
Well, one issue that's always in the background in Irish politics, of course, is reunification. And Mary Lou McDonald, the head of Sinn Féin, said that consent can only be tested in a unity referendum, and we are going to have a unity referendum. I want us to do that in an orderly, thoughtful, democratic, and absolutely peaceful manner. So her position is the Good Friday Accords say that reunification is a subject of referendum. So do you see that on the horizon?
well, Boris Johnson disagrees, so it'll be a constitutional crisis of some kind there.
But we're going to see the same issue with Scotland, not with Wales, but the whole issue of what the United Kingdom is going to look like, 10, 15 years from now is looming large.
Sure, I agree.
Well, we'll have to keep an eye on that one. So to our panel, thank you once again. As always, to our viewers, stay healthy out there, wash your hands frequently, and we'll see you next time on International Focus.
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.